In 1945, the Second World War came to an end in Europe. What followed was not only the collapse of Nazi Germany, but the beginning of one of the most complex justice processes in modern history. Entire cities lay in ruins. Governments across Europe were rebuilding from nothing. And at the same time, Allied forces were confronted with a question that had no clear precedent. How do you judge the leadership of a regime responsible for mass war crimes on an unprecedented scale? The Nuremberg Trials would soon become the center of this effort. For the first time, international law attempted to prosecute senior political and military figures not only for acts of war, but for crimes committed against civilians on a systemic level. But even as preparations for these trials began, it became clear that the end of the war had not brought full clarity. Many members of the Nazi leadership had been captured. Some had died in the final days of the conflict. Others had disappeared in the chaos of the collapse. Documents were missing, identities were uncertain, and in the immediate aftermath of 1945, Allied authorities were faced with a fragmented and incomplete picture of the former regime. This documentary explores what happened next, not only the trials that defined post-war justice, but also the gaps, limitations, and historical realities that shaped the fate of those who once held power in the Third Reich. Because the end of the war did not mean the end of the story. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was in its final phase of collapse. Allied forces were advancing from the west, while Soviet troops pushed steadily toward Berlin from the east. The German military structure, once one of the most organized war machines in Europe, was rapidly breaking down under pressure on multiple fronts. In the final months of the war, communication systems failed, supply lines were destroyed, and central command became increasingly fragmented. Orders from Berlin often no longer matched the reality on the ground. In many regions, local commanders were acting independently as coordination across the state structure disintegrated. As defeat became inevitable, a number of high-ranking officials began to vanish from public view. Some remained with military units until the final surrender. Others attempted to flee or went into hiding as Allied forces advanced. Several senior figures died during this period, including Adolf Hitler, who died by suicide in April 1945 in Berlin alongside members of his inner circle. When Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, the situation facing the Allied forces was not a simple transition from war to peace, but a vast administrative and investigative challenge. Millions of soldiers were being disarmed and processed, while at the same time authorities began identifying individuals who had held positions within the Nazi political and security apparatus. The scale of the task was unprecedented. Records had been destroyed in the final stages of the war. Many documents were scattered or incomplete, and in the chaos of collapse, some individuals had already left their known positions or assumed false identities. Germany was then divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Each of these powers began the process of detention, investigation, and classification of former officials, laying the groundwork for what would become a coordinated international effort. But even in these early months, it became clear that accountability would not be uniform. Some individuals were quickly identified and detained. Others remained unaccounted for in the immediate aftermath of the war, as the full structure of the former regime continued to unravel. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Allied powers faced a legal and moral problem that had no clear historical precedent. Entire state structures had been involved in organizing war, occupation, and large-scale crimes across Europe. Traditional national courts were not designed to process responsibility on this level. In response, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France established the International Military Tribunal, headquartered in the German city of Nuremberg. The choice of location was symbolic. Nuremberg had been associated with major Nazi Party rallies during the rise of the regime, and now became the setting for its legal reckoning. The trials formally began in November 1945. The defendants included some of the highest-ranking surviving officials of the Nazi state, among them Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Rosenberg, and others. They were not tried for membership in an ideology alone, but for specific categories of internationally defined crimes. These charges included crimes against peace, referring to the planning and initiation of aggressive war crimes covering violations of the laws of armed conflict, and crimes against humanity, a newly defined legal category addressing systematic persecution, deportation, and mass violence against civilian populations. One of the defining features of the Nuremberg process was its reliance on extensive documentation. The prosecution presented captured official records, military orders, internal correspondence, and filmed evidence collected from liberated territories. This marked a shift in international justice toward evidentiary systems based heavily on bureaucratic records and state documentation. The tribunal also heard testimony from witnesses, including survivors of concentration camps and individuals who had worked within the Nazi administrative system. The combination of documentary and oral evidence created a detailed reconstruction of how the regime operated at multiple levels. The verdicts were delivered in October 1946. 12 defendants were sentenced to death. Several received long prison terms, and a small number were acquitted. The trials were widely recognized as a foundational moment in international law, establishing principles that continue to influence legal systems today. At the same time, the scope of Nuremberg was necessarily limited. The tribunal could only process those who were captured, identified, and made available for trial within a specific time frame. As a result, it represented a structured and formalized segment of accountability, rather than a complete judicial accounting of all individuals involved in the Nazi system. Nuremberg defined the framework of post-war justice, but it did not and could not encompass every case connected to the collapse of the Third Reich. Although the Nuremberg trials established a new foundation for international justice, they could only address a fraction of those involved in the Nazi system. The scale of the former regime was vast, extending far beyond the group of senior officials brought before the tribunal. In the immediate post-war period, the Allied authorities faced practical limitations. Millions of individuals required screening, from military personnel to administrative staff who had been part of the state apparatus in varying capacities. Identifying levels of responsibility was not always straightforward, particularly when documentation had been destroyed or was incomplete. Another key factor was the difference in legal and political priorities among the Allied powers. While there was a shared commitment to prosecution of major war criminals, each occupying administration operated within its own zone and under its own evolving strategic concerns. This resulted in variations in how investigations were conducted and how resources were allocated. As a consequence, the initial focus remained on the highest-ranking figures who were clearly linked to policymaking and large-scale decisions. Lower-level participants and mid-ranking officials were often processed through separate denazification programs, which varied significantly in strictness and outcome, depending on region and time period. Over time, the practical scope of prosecution narrowed further. As Europe entered the early stages of Reconstruction and geopolitical tensions shifted into the emerging Cold War, priorities began to change. Stability, rebuilding, and intelligence considerations increasingly influenced how former officials were treated. In this context, not all cases resulted in formal trials. Some individuals were investigated and later released. Others were subject to administrative penalties rather than criminal prosecution. A smaller number remained untraced for extended periods after the war due to incomplete records or movement across borders during the final months of the conflict. The result was a post-war justice system that was both groundbreaking and uneven. It succeeded in establishing legal precedents that remain fundamental today, but it also reflected the constraints of its time. Limited resources, fragmented information, and rapidly changing political realities. This combination of legal ambition and practical limitation would shape the fate of many individuals associated with the former regime in the years that followed. In the years immediately following 1945, the Allied occupation authorities continued to locate, detain, and process former members of the Nazi state. However, alongside these official efforts, a parallel reality emerged. Some individuals managed to leave Europe and establish new identities abroad. Historians refer to parts of this phenomenon as Ratlines, informal escape networks that helped certain former officials and collaborators travel from post-war Europe to destinations outside the continent, most commonly in South America and the Middle East. These routes were not centralized or uniform, and their structure varied significantly depending on time, location, and the individuals involved. One of the key challenges of the immediate post-war environment was the sheer scale of displacement. Millions of people were moving across Europe, including refugees, displaced persons, former soldiers, and civilians returning home. In this environment, identity verification was often difficult, especially in the early stages of occupation, when administrative systems were still being rebuilt. Some escape routes involved forged or incomplete documentation. Others relied on the chaotic conditions of displaced persons camps and cross-border movement before full screening procedures were implemented. In certain cases, assistance was provided through personal, religious, or political networks that operated independently of official state structures. The extent and nature of this assistance remains a subject of historical research and debate, and varies depending on individual cases and sources. A number of former Nazi officials are known to have successfully reached countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Syria, where they lived under assumed identities or integrated into local communities. In some cases, their presence was only confirmed years later through investigations, intelligence reports, or extradition efforts. It is important to note that these outcomes were not uniform. Many individuals who attempted to flee were captured during transit or identified shortly after arrival in other countries. Others remained in Europe and were later brought to trial or investigated during denazification processes. The existence of post-war escape networks highlights the complexity of the immediate aftermath of the conflict. While international efforts were focused on accountability through formal legal mechanisms, the realities of post-war displacement, administrative disruption, and geopolitical transition created conditions in which not all movements could be fully monitored or controlled. These developments would later become part of broader historical and intelligence studies of the post-war period as governments and researchers sought to reconstruct how former officials moved through a rapidly changing global environment. By the late 1940s, the political landscape of the world had begun to shift once again. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany gradually gave way to growing tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, marking the beginning of the Cold War. This new geopolitical reality had a direct impact on how post-war justice was implemented. While the immediate focus after 1945 had been accountability and prosecution, the emerging rivalry between East and West increasingly influenced strategic decisions made by governments on both sides. In this context, some individuals with technical, scientific, or administrative expertise who had previously been part of the German wartime system became subjects of interest for intelligence and research programs. One of the most well-documented examples of this shift is the U.S. Operation Paperclip, through which German scientists were recruited to work in the United States, particularly in fields related to rocketry, aeronautics, and engineering. The rationale behind such programs was largely driven by competition in technological and military development. As the Cold War intensified, the priority for many governments shifted toward securing strategic advantages in science and defense, sometimes resulting in pragmatic decisions that complicated earlier approaches to justice. At the same time, international efforts to locate and prosecute remaining individuals connected to the Nazi regime continued, but with varying intensity depending on region, available resources, and evolving political focus. Some investigations were pursued over decades, while others lost momentum as new global priorities emerged. It is within this broader context that the post-war period must be understood, not as a single unified process, but as a complex intersection of legal accountability, reconstruction efforts, and emerging geopolitical competition. These overlapping priorities contributed to an uneven historical outcome. While many individuals were brought to trial or served sentences, the post-war world was no longer focused solely on retrospective justice, but also on shaping the future balance of global power. While the post-war justice system varied in scope and consistency, several high-profile cases from the Nazi leadership provide a clearer picture of how accountability was ultimately carried out. One of the most prominent defendants at Nuremberg was Hermann Göring, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Nazi state. He was sentenced to death, but took his own life in his cell shortly before the execution was carried out. His case remains one of the most widely studied examples of the tribunal's reach and its limits. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, was also sentenced to death and executed in 1946. His trial focused on diplomatic actions and his role in shaping foreign policy decisions during the war. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was likewise sentenced to death and executed, with the tribunal emphasizing his role in issuing and transmitting military orders linked to war crimes. Not all high-ranking defendants received the death penalty. Albert Speer, who served as Minister of Armaments and War Production, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His defense centered on claims of limited knowledge of certain crimes, a position that has been widely analyzed and debated by historians in the decades since. Karl Dönitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state after the collapse of the regime, received a 10-year prison sentence. His case reflected the tribunal's effort to distinguish between different levels of responsibility within the remaining leadership structure. Another figure, Martin Bormann, was tried in absentia, as his fate was unknown at the time of the proceedings. He was later declared dead though the exact circumstances surrounding his death were confirmed only years afterward through forensic and historical investigation. These cases illustrate the range of outcomes produced by the post-war justice system, from execution to imprisonment, from conviction in absentia to unresolved disappearance at the time of trial. Taken together, they demonstrate that accountability was not uniform, but rather shaped by a combination of legal evidence, availability of defendants, and the evolving conditions of the post-war world. As the immediate post-war trials concluded, the question of justice for the former leadership of Nazi Germany did not end. Instead, it gradually shifted from the courtroom into the broader sphere of politics, historical interpretation, and collective memory. The Nuremberg Trials established important legal precedents, but they also reflected the conditions of their time. The decisions made during the proceedings were influenced not only by evidence and legal argument, but also by the political realities of a rapidly changing world order. As the Cold War began to reshape international relations, priorities increasingly extended beyond prosecution alone. In the years that followed, additional trials and investigations were carried out in different countries and jurisdictions. Some individuals who had not been part of the main Nuremberg proceedings were later identified and prosecuted. Others were subject to denazification processes, which aimed to assess responsibility on a broader societal level, though outcomes varied significantly depending on region and implementation. At the same time, historical understanding of the Nazi system continued to develop. Access to archives, survivor testimonies, and later declassified documents contributed to an evolving picture of how responsibility was distributed across different levels of the regime. This ongoing research has remained an active field of historical study for decades. Public memory of these events also evolved unevenly across countries. In some places, emphasis was placed on legal accountability and reconstruction, while in others, political narratives influenced how the post-war period was interpreted and discussed. The result is a historical landscape in which justice, politics, and memory are closely intertwined. The post-war period cannot be understood solely through the outcomes of formal trials, but must also be viewed through the long-term processes of documentation, education, and historical reassessment. This complexity is one of the defining features of the legacy of the Second World War. A legal response that was groundbreaking, but also shaped and limited by the realities of its time. The end of the Second World War marked a turning point in the history of international law. The Nuremberg Trials introduced a framework that defined individual responsibility for state actions on a scale that had never been formally addressed before. For the first time, leaders of a defeated regime were held accountable in an international court for crimes committed during wartime and against civilian populations. At the same time, the post-war process was not complete in a strict or uniform sense. The scale of the former regime, the chaos of its collapse, and the rapidly changing political environment of the late 1940s meant that justice was implemented in stages under conditions that were often uncertain and evolving. Some individuals faced trial and received sentences that became part of legal history. Others were processed through different systems of investigation and denazification. A number of cases remained unresolved for years, gradually clarified only through later historical research and archival access. Over time, the legacy of this period became more than a legal record. It became part of how modern societies understand responsibility, accountability, and the limits of justice in times of extreme conflict. The principles established during this era continue to influence international courts and legal systems today. But the historical record also shows that justice in practice is rarely absolute. It is shaped by available information, political conditions, and the realities of the time in which it is carried out. The aftermath of the Third Reich remains one of the most studied and debated chapters of the 20th century, not only for what was prosecuted, but also for what could not be fully addressed in the immediate years after 1945. And in that space between law and history, the question of justice continues to remain relevant long after the war itself ended. If you enjoyed this documentary, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future long-form historical documentaries. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and suggest topics you would like to see covered in future videos. Your ideas help shape the next documentaries on this channel.